Hello, everyone, and welcome to our presentation. This is for the Charleston Conference. We're glad that you are making time to look at our research and consider our findings today on evidence-based acquisition plans. So this is a comparative study of the implementation and management and evaluation of evidence-based acquisition plans. And to introduce ourselves, my name is Chris Palazzolo, and I am the Director of Collections and Open Strategies and a social sciences librarian on the side at Woodruff Library and Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. Bill?
My name is William Jacobs. I am a subject librarian working with STEM and video game studies and comic book studies at San Francisco State University with heavy dabbling in collections.
Hi, I'm Matthew Javeli. I am newly the Associate College Librarian for Technical Services at Colorado College.
All right. And just a reminder about the code of conduct that the Charleston Conference has, which is represented on this slide. So just please remind yourself of that as you engage with the speakers and questions and Q&A. So a brief introduction to what we're presenting on today. Again, this focus of this research is on evidence-based acquisitions, and primarily on ebook acquisitions, although we're well aware that EBAs can also be applied to AV materials as well. But we have noticed, and I'm sure you have as well, and may already have many EBAs in place at your local institution, and that they become more widespread across academic libraries. We did a very brief review of some of our vendors and looking about how many EBA plans they had implemented, and it ranges everywhere from 25 to up to 235 for the largest vendor. That kind of just gives you an idea of kind of what's currently implemented at this current time. Bill will talk a little bit more about this, but the literature so far has been mostly focused on institution-specific adoption of EBAs, and it's been very mainly correlational, very individually focused, and not so much comparative, which is how we're proposing to do a little bit broader research and trying to find some trends and analyze those across institutions of different sizes and different approaches. So then again, we're looking at more motivations, patterns of implementation, and evaluation of EBAs across. We'll talk a little bit more about our methodology in a few moments, but I'll let Bill talk a little bit about the literature that we drew from or where we found some gaps in that led to us investigating these sort of trends across our peers.
So we found that EBA programs are quite widespread, but the literature is very sparse. There's no more than a dozen or so papers out there. Although the term was used in other contexts earlier, the earliest discussion of EBA as we know it today, what we found was by Levine Clark in 2015, and in their evidence-based selection at University of Denver. And they only said our selection criteria in both years, 2013, 2014, were straightforward. We purchased all the titles in 2013 that had multiple use and chose single-use titles on political science and international relations, particular areas of interest for their campus. So the first thing we found that had any real depth was Robolith in 2015, who did their own survey, but that was so early that in their consortia, they found that most did not currently nor previously had used an evidence-based purchase model for ebooks. So they weren't really able to find anything out. Looking through the literature after that, I found that most discussion of purchasing or renewing focused on subject alignment with the local interests and, of course, on price. And most discussion of title selection focused on purchasing the most used titles, of course, just basic usage, or when usage was quite low for one use or two use, throwing it back to the subject selectors. So 2013, a couple of years ago, Jacobs, that's me, and David Hellman, my head of collection development, decided to publish on some more complicated and sophisticated work that we were doing in our selection from our EBA programs. And we published that, and we also went around to a few different conferences to talk about what we're doing and see what other folks were doing as well. Along with high usage, we looked at use patterns over extended periods of time, cost per use based on various types of usage, and brought the subject selectors in to select based on local areas of interest as well. Next slide. So we found that there was a lot of interest in what we were doing. And when people talked to us, we found that they were doing some really interesting stuff that just wasn't reflected in the scholarship. So working with the folks here today, we thought we'd go ahead and ask libraries more about their EBA activities.
And so I'll talk a little bit about the methodology and how we went about this. We did a Qualtrics survey this summer 2024. And it was distributed by all three of us via major e-resource and collections listservs, as well as a little bit by word of mouth and so forth. And we'll talk about in terms of our participation rate, which I believe was pretty good. Matt will talk about that in a few moments. But what we asked for, a number of things about demographics, in terms of just to kind of get an idea of the structure of certain universities and the respondents and how big their budgets were, how they were manage their ebook collection management in terms of budget, the size of these two, all the sort of things to kind of give us an idea, and also to provide some details that maybe we look for some correlations later on and some further analysis. But really, we're looking at why individuals, the motivation, why individual institutions decided to join an EBA, what led them to do EBA. We had a lot of ideas around why one might, because of cost, easy projected cost, diversity of the collection, expanding access, so forth. But we kind of wanted to throw that out to the participants. And then why it was adopted, why they ended up adopting it. And then kind of two separate things about title selection at the end of a cycle, EBA, as well as looking as to whether or not one would want to renew that EBA and or cancel it, and why, and what kind of motivated that, and how that was assessed. And finally, we just opened it up at the very end for general comments. I will say we'll come back to this towards the end of the presentation, but we also had a question in the survey for a future contact by the three of us for potential interviews as a follow-up study. So we got a very good turnout for those potential interviews later on for the post survey. So I'm going to give it to Matt to start talking about our respondents and talk about some of our initial findings from the survey.
All right, I'm going to share with you some of the results from our survey, especially related to the participating institutions and their collections. First, I'd like to thank all of our participants. Obviously, this presentation wouldn't have been available without many of you. We had representatives from 81 unique institutions participating in the survey. About 42% of those came from large schools with over 20,000 students. Another 30% came from institutions between 10 and 20,000, and the rest came from smaller schools with fewer than 10,000 students. Next, as you might expect, the distribution regarding size of school roughly corresponds to the distribution of the research output of those schools. 44% of our participants were from R1 institutions. Those are the ones with the highest research output. 27% from R2 schools, the medium research output, are still high, but not as high as the R1s. And the rest came from schools with less of a research focus. Next. We were interested to know about the role of EBAs within libraries' ebook collection strategies. So we asked participants about the percentages of their ebook budgets represented by firm orders, EBAs, DDAs, and packages. Those responses are represented in this set of box plots. To interpret a box plot, the colored box part shows the middle 50% of responses with a line at the median. The whiskers, those lines above or below, correspond to the, not yet.
Okay.
The whiskers above or below correspond to the high and low values. The dots show outliers. Most libraries dedicated some funds to firm orders, with a few institutions dedicating more than the median to firm orders. Most participants dedicated between 5 and 30% of their ebook funds to EBAs. DDAs received the smallest portion of funding, typically between 0 and 15% in our respondents. The widest range of results were for packages. Some institutions were dedicating all of their funds to packages, some dedicating none. About half were somewhere in between the 10 and 60% of their ebook funds. All right, next. Our survey asked how many EBAs each institution participated in. 12 of the respondents, or about 15%, were not currently participating in any EBAs and were not asked this question. Of those who participated in at least one EBA, about half were in 1 or 2. The rest were mostly in a 3 to 8 range, with one notable outlier at the 13 EBAs range. Next. A couple of highlights from the comments section regarding the number of EBAs. First, we saw evidence that some institutions were still experimenting with EBAs and thinking of expanding. One notes we would like to expand our EBA programs in the coming years, but are limited by budget cuts. The institution that had 13 EBAs noted that they reviewed their EBAs in 2021 in response to COVID lockdowns and doubled their number of EBAs recently. They wrote that EBAs offered an excellent ROI and flexibility for their large research-intensive institution. And the number of EBAs, we should note, may vary depending on how participants interpreted the question. At least one institution only reported its institution's own EBAs, but excluded the consortial ones. Next. We asked participants about what motivated them to start their first EBA, allowing them to select several responses. The biggest motivations were to expand access and to align to user needs. Saving selection time was important to many participants, but not as many as some of us on the study expected. Fewer respondents reported a desire to diversify collections or increase overall ebook use, and only 10 noted that their first EBA was motivated by closures from COVID. A few highlights from the comments about the motivations. One school notes that while they did some experimenting with EBAs prior to the pandemic really pushed them into more, and their experiences with those EBAs alleviated some of the initial skepticism they had. Another noted that they had ditched their approval plans in favor of EBAs. A third said that EBAs played a role in the ongoing balance of needs between access and ownership. Their institution needed more access, which encouraged them to pursue those EBAs. While diversity was highlighted by relatively few institutions, it was a motivation for some. One notes EBA programs are a way to provide a diverse array of books to users to cover subject areas that might not have seen recent attention by librarians. Next. We asked libraries when their first EBA began. There were a few who reported starting in the early 2010s before we even thought there were EBAs. But the first increase we saw really was in 2016. That does mean that most of the surveyed librarians have been using EBAs for less than a decade. The quick pace of adoption continued throughout the late 2010s, although thanks. Although a few of our participants said that their first EBA, only a few said that it was in response to closure. We see a large number of libraries reporting starting their first EBA in 2020, the first year of the pandemic. Since then, the number of new libraries adopting EBAs has slowed, at least among our respondents. It's possible that EBAs may have matured to the point where a majority of the libraries who are going to use them have already experimented with them. And now I'm going to hand it off again.
All right. Then we looked at how folks decided to actually adopt or to subscribe to an EBA plan. In other words, what led to that decision. And this chart gives you means importance. Folks were asked to rank in this case. And it does seem that budget matters or budget concerns definitely ranked the highest, and probably not too surprising of a finding. But we also found very strong for alignment with the current collection, the years included, and of also very interested to mark records. In other words, discoverability of those titles in the library catalog. But you'll see that there are quite a few other, the distribution here is quite wide here, a lot for gap filling, completeness of the collection of the EBA being offered by the publisher or the vendor, the price, how much backfile content is there, and so forth. It's seen a little less for duplication of print and customization, but they're still certainly ranked decently high here, at least at affordance level of 3 out of 5. And then again, pulling a little bit from the comments that we received as part of the study. So if, a few folks were noting that in terms of evaluating an EBA, they're paying a lot of attention to exactly what is in the EBA in terms of what they're investing in, and what they should focus on. So the first one really focuses a little bit on what the content or the subject areas and how much customization, for example, can be offered by the publisher and how this customization can be managed. A theme of management will come up again later on, and time saving and so forth, and all those pressures. Another important one here goes back to the issue of, or the concern for discoverability and MARC records, is how much available it is in the knowledge base, for how much these records are available and how it can be managed through a knowledge base, particularly for titles that move in and out of a collection. It'd be interesting to talk a little bit more to this respondent and see kind of what their a little bit more of their logic here. But also that copyright years and content is included, and particularly how that relates to budget. So there's a lot for us to dig a little deeper into this section, and which we possibly could do a little bit further on. So moving ahead to who makes selection decisions. So this is one of the big questions that we were really interested in or curious about, is that who is involved in this whole process at the end of a cycle for these EBA programs, who actually is making decisions. And Bill talked a little bit about this in referring to his research from 2023, and to how involving certain other groups who may have not been involved before, such as subject librarians, into the mix. So we'll see here, we kind of gave some broad categories of librarians here or staff. And of course, every institution has very distinct position statements. So this may not cover also of these, so it might be interesting again to dig a little deeper in future study. But collections librarian tended to be the highest one, although subject librarians in terms of number of respondents was higher than we kind of had expected there. Technical services staff, ECR staff, we were thinking in that, or electronic teaching resources. And then we had a category for other, which is kind of a catch-all. We were also wondering if anyone was kind of working with the no one assigned, meaning that were they just depending on vendor reports and letting the vendor decide based on some parameter or criteria for selecting titles at the end. It will be interesting to look at if there are variations at different institutions at different sizes, and whether or not that correlates here with who is actually working on the title selection at the end of a EBA cycle. Then we looked a little bit at title selection criteria, and we asked folks, you know, as opposed to who was making the selection of titles, we were looking at what are those folks using in terms of a rubric or criteria or so on, or motivation for selecting those titles. And we offered respondents quite a wide variety of potential options here. These are not meant to be exhaustive. These are ones that we had thought would be the most likely. And as you can see here, course adoption, current year uses tended to win out overall in terms of their importance. Those titles that were then used by a course, of course, were much more likely to be chosen for long-term perpetual access, and in some cases may be chosen because these are titles that may not have been purchased on a regular basis, collection-wise, part of collection policy by institutions such as textbooks or course texts. But we see that there are quite a wide variety of motivations here, such as the use over time, the alignment to collection, the subject librarian, and what here we meant is, you know, was there a subject librarian emphasis, or there's kind of goes back to subject librarians were involved in selections if they had noted or designated certain titles that they felt, regardless of use, should be added perpetually into the collection. Again, a future study here would be very interesting to look at to see how these things kind of balance out at different institutions. Because again, this is kind of but it does show here that this is a complicated matter and that there is quite a wide variety of approaches and motivations that go into title selection. So it is a complex process, as kind of these findings suggest. This is the same chart, but done with means on the 1 to 5 scale. So that in the just a different way of looking at that same data. Right. And again, pulling again from the comments, which we like to emphasize were extremely eye-opening and very rich. There are a few interesting themes that kind of that we pulled out here. One is particularly for potentially static EBAs for particular collections or subject areas and so forth, that after many years of an EBA, this first one indicates that it may be difficult to find more titles to meet the deposit that the institution made because they've already exhausted all the high use titles. So and then there would have been again another interesting one. Interesting element here is about the management, again, which is a theme we found over and over again in terms of title selection and motivations in terms of adopting EBAs and managing them overall. And then another thing about title selection criteria here, go to the same theme, is the selection process is more time consuming than I expected, which is an interesting finding, particularly when we think of one of the questions we had earlier about how EBAs are, we thought they're more of a time-saving measure, particularly if they're more automated, not based or dependent on individual subject librarian material selection. But there may be a trade-off there. And then the last one here is about total, just how this particular respondent responds to title selection and makes those choices, particularly by total usage. And looking particularly, and it's making the assumption that those with high usage are the ones that are being adopted by different classes at their respective institution. And then looking at assessment of EBAs, this is looking at what kind of sources folks do look at EBAs and particularly what kind of statistics they're looking at. And we did find that most are depending on vendors and looking at cost per use. Some are actually putting their own stats, maybe looking at something that's a little bit different than what the vendor is providing. There's a lot of variation here, and there's a lot more we could have asked in this particular area, and much more. We could have delved a little bit deeper. We were trying to get an understanding of what overall approach folks are taking and what statistics or measures or usage data individual institutions were pulling from. And the last one to notice here is something for locally harvested data. For example, it's easy proxy logs. Some folks were looking at those as well, in addition to what the vendor was providing, or if that was just another way or another window into usage, maybe looking at particular sets of users in the EBA. Oops, sorry about that. Here we go. And finally, looking at renewal and cancellations, this is kind of the last big thing we're looking at in the study. And this was saying what led to folks keeping an EBA or canceling an EBA and so forth. And again, there's a big variation here, but we did find a few themes and the overall cost per use of the collection in terms of its use for a particular university or institution, the deposit increase, that went up over time, but the content did not go up accordingly. And then we also looked at, also particularly important was the proportion of titles used. But interestingly enough, things like difficulty in management did score pretty high, as well as the change in available content. And I will note here that we didn't specifically say, put a question as such as, if the program became more, the EBA plan became more difficult to manage, would you be more or less willing to renew or cancel? We're just looking whether or not it's a factor in those decisions. This is something, again, we could explore a little bit more with potential interviews in a future study. Again, this is the same chart again, but with a little bit of a, we're looking at means again, as opposed to raw numbers of respondents. And so why have you discontinued an EBA? we've looked at good things, low overall use, budget cuts. Again, budget is paramount in a lot of these decisions, as we're noting, probably. And then again, difficulty in managing cost increases, kind of going down lower on the distribution. But you'll see definitely the kind of those who have discontinued the EBA, overall use and budget cuts seem to be the most important motivations for that. A few comments here about again, kind of reiterate some of those themes: cost increases, low usage. Sometimes it came down to about overlap and issues of overlapping with the general plan versus a publisher plan. And then one goes back to a thing we saw earlier, which was that EBA has kind of run its some way that it's exhausted the titles that are going to be used. And so therefore it does not make sense to continue it on a cost calculus. All right, so I'm going to hand it off. That's a lot of data for everyone to see. But I'm going to hand it off to Bill to talk a little bit about some of the general comments and themes that we saw overarching. I've kind of addressed a few of these or intimated some of these, but Bill will kind of highlight some of the interesting across the board.
So we had many opportunities for folks to leave comments along with doing statistical data. And while we do have a lot more of analysis to do on that hard data, their comments really do tell stories on their own. People had a lot to share. And I think the one basic thing is that people have been working on this solo. And there may be a nascent community of practice here to get folks together to really understand how other people are working on EBA. Some of the general themes that came out in the comments were that budget constraints were a big problem. Management is an issue here as well, and a variety of different attitudes towards EBA as a collection strategy. There are different ways of thinking about it, whether it is mostly about the access or mostly about the selection at the end. Next slide, please. So you'll have a chance to read all of these comments in detail. I believe our slides will be available, or you could just pause me at any moment. But I'd like to just discuss some of the themes that come out in these. And one here is that the workload of maintaining EBA programs, particularly in an era of shrinking staffs, came up repeatedly. And this does seem to be a limiting factor in both the number of EBA programs subscribed to and the complication of the title selection criteria and who's doing it and how sophisticated the process can be. Next slide. So management also is an issue here. EBA is still pretty new, and many different vendors are finding many different ways to work with the collections folks with them, and having it be different with every vendor is adding extra time and effort to the library's workloads and managing them. And people have mentioned this repeatedly. We're hoping that our work might help to point the vendors to some best practices. What do the collections folks want? So that they can unify and simplify management and make this a more effective way to collect books. Next slide. So despite these challenges, and we've discussed this a lot, there were a lot of positive comments as well. We do find EBA programs to be a successful collection strategy for our libraries. So knowing your spend in advance, having access to this large number of DRM-free titles, and at least theoretically a streamlined selection process are all real tangible benefits that people pointed out. Okay.
All right. So we've shown you a lot of data and shared a lot of comments and kind of addressed a few things we saw from this survey. We now we're going to give you a little bit of an overview of our next steps are. We're looking to do a little bit further analysis. As we mentioned earlier, we're possibly looking at a little bit more sophisticated, where we can, statistical approach, particularly maybe looking at school institutional size, looking and seeing if those correlate with certain factors or motivations for continuation of EBAs, title selections, et cetera, that may help elucidate some of those a little bit more. And all of this is kind of in relation or in preparation for an article that we'd like to put together where we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the data and possibly, as I just mentioned, have a fewer different slides, a fewer different charts and tables, and dig a little deeper into some of those findings and really possibly also create some recommendations or somewhat future study at the end, as kind of what Bill was mentioning about possibly influencing some best practices, et cetera. We would definitely like to do some follow-up interviews. As I mentioned earlier, we did get a very good response to folks who were willing to talk to us post-survey. And so that's definitely something that we would like to do because oftentimes a qualitative study in such a way will really get to the heart of the matter and be able to follow up on certain themes and really understand how an EBA plan is or is not working at a particular institution. So the comments and in particular in this study for the kind of qualitative portion, but to then follow up with a conversation with different library staff would be very helpful. And then just identify some areas for further research and kind of this obviously not the end all and be all of this. One thing we would possibly like to look at is possibly correlate this a little bit with what is happening in the marketplace as well, seeing if there have been increases or decreases over time on the vendor side and what they're kind of seeing in terms of adoptions and so forth. So just to kind of see how representative we are of the EBA landscape. So that's what we have for you. We're more than happy to take some questions and look forward to engaging with you on this topic, and feel free to reach out to any of us for further information, or if you have some other experiences working with the EBA that you'd like to share, we'd be more than happy to hear those as we work on our next part of this analysis for the article that we're preparing. So thanks everyone for coming, and we hope to hear from you soon.